Good evening, everybody. If I can make this work, let's see. There we go. Where are the screens? Oh, there they are, okay. So, is everybody well fed? Is everybody comfortable and happy? Warm, good, okay. Should we just call it a night now and just get on home? Okay, but thank you everybody for coming, and I like to have fun with these things, so I do hope that you enjoy a good laugh or two. I promise I'll keep the Star Trek jokes to a minimum. Well, beam me up, I'm game, you know. There will be moments where I will ask some questions. I don't mind audience engagement during these events, but of course, I'm more than happy to address any questions at the end of it, which is how these are traditionally done. And once again, thank you everybody for coming. I did want to let you know though that as soon as I walked in the door, Daryl didn't let me off the hook either. He said, "Excuse me, sir, would you like to make a donation?" To which point I had to pull out my wallet before he even let me in through the front gate. So once again, I say good evening, and before we begin, I just want to give a special thanks to the student ambassadors. Dr. Haggerty unfortunately could not make it tonight, but I am very appreciative of Dr. Riley, our new vice president, for being here. The fellow faculty, if there are any in the audience, thank you for coming, as well as the greater Lake County community. So thank you everybody for taking your time out of your night to do this, to be here with me. For tonight's Salon lecture series, The Future Happened Yesterday, I want to examine some of the past, present, and future science fiction literature that are unified by their desire to explore the future, consider the possibilities of both time and space, and if we're lucky, give us a sense of maybe where we are, where we could go, or perhaps where we should go. So, if we look around nowadays, we can kind of notice that the future literally is right now. I mean, it's 2024. To me, 1993 was yesterday. I can't imagine how it feels for other people. But we call it the present, and at least it is that as far as the past is concerned, but it is starting to suspiciously feel like the future is catching up to us. Does anybody else have this feeling? Yeah. Whether it's that iPhone that has more computing power than the Apollo 11 spacecraft, whether it's your car that starts talking to you and you say, "What is it you're asking me? I don't understand." Or whether it's the automated phone systems that we have to get into arguments with and say, "I want to talk to a human." All of these technological innovations have something in common. They're advancing the present to catch up with what was once considered the future. Here comes the first Star Trek reference. When James Kirk would flip out his tricorder and ask for destinations to a location or to another crew member, he was instantly given that information through what we would have now considered the Wi-Fi, but back then was just the magic of this little set device that he had holding in his hand. Well, nowadays we just call those our smartphones. So the future is very slowly, or I should say very quickly, catching up to what we used to consider it in the past. I'll try to keep those words separate from now on. It is filled with good things, though. We've made significant progress in the fields of engineering, robotics, medicine, and computing. However, clean energy remains an elusive dispute. We're still working to colonize Mars. And finally, our civilization has yet to invent hoverboards. I don't know about the rest of you, but that has been on my Christmas wish list for 35 years. Some other current events to marvel over. On the plus side, last March, Statistica estimated that the internet is now available for approximately 66% of the human population. That's 5.35 billion people who have the ability to go on YouTube and figure out how to change a tire. We're observing the cosmos in incredibly complex ways, awe-inspiring ways, thanks to telescopes like the Event Horizon, which in 2019 gave us our first clearest photograph of a black hole in the M86 galaxy. And finally, according to NASA, the Perseverance rover may have found evidence of life on Mars though the Viking 1 lander that landed on the Red Planet in 1976, a recent study indicated that life may have been accidentally killed off. Sorry. It's kind of an interesting story if you go and you look at the news articles for it, but what they did was the Viking 1 had a scooping tray. They lifted some of the soil into the tray, diluted it with water to see if there would be any microbial reactions. There were not. As it turns out, water was probably not the best universal solvent. They say now that they should have used salt. I think that this raises a really interesting question in terms of the progression of science going farther than we may have imagined back in the 1950s and certainly in the 1970s. But it raises the question, like, has Earth now become an interplanetary conqueror? If we did destroy microbial life on Mars, have we now earned that to our status title? Who's to say? It might make a good sequel for War of the Worlds Part 2. But this isn't the only good news. We have a growing number of affordable electrical cars, as difficult as they are to charge. We've revolutionized urban transportation with electrical scooters, despite walking still being the best known form of exercise. We even have flying cars and buses. That is right, flying cars and buses. We call them helicopters and airplanes, but that's what they are. Artificial intelligence is a growing reality. We've split and photographed the atom, and it's not difficult to imagine in the years to come the very first lunar Starbucks. That reminds me of Mel Brooks' Spaceballs. At this very moment, Voyager 1 and 2, which both launched in 1977, just a few months apart, they're in interstellar space, in a cosmos that I can't even begin to pronounce. And while most of their functions have now been shut off, they serve as ambassadors to the rest of the galaxy, which is kind of amazing when you think about it. They giant electrical boxes with antennae and scopes and communications arrays sticking off of them. They're heading out into the void of space to be picked up by who knows who and who knows when. Their gold-plated welcome packages, who knows who might read them or what they might think of those messages that were put together by SETI and Carl Sagan. The Artemis program is going to launch Artemis 2 in September of 2025. And that's going to be our return to the moon. Both astronauts Christina Koch and Victor Glover will be respectively the first female and African American to land on the lunar surface. That's quite an accomplishment. That is what was once in the past considered unimaginable and is now we're catching up to it in our own present. Finally, this is my favorite one, the Europa Clipper is a probe that was launched in 2024. It's due to make its orbital insertion on the icy moon of Jupiter, Europa, in about 2030. And it's stated, among its objectives, it is to confirm the existence and characterize the nature of water within or beneath the surface of the moon, of Europa. And just imagine that for a second. As a science fiction writer, as a science fiction enthusiast, within the next few years, we may discover microbial life or even gigantic colossal beasts beneath the ocean of this frozen ice world that is orbiting around this enormous gas giant. That's the stuff of Robert Heinlein. That's the stuff of Arthur C. Clarke. These are the novels and the stories that from the 40s, the 50s, into the 60s and 80s became the popular movies and TV shows that we saw develop over the last several decades. And that kind of stuff is starting to happen now. All of this is happening now. So I again ask the question, and this is what started me on this Salon presentation topic, what impact is this going to have on science fiction literature? It's got to have some impact. Oh, sorry, I forgot to show my slides there. That's the Voyager 1 and 2. The Artemis project, of course. And Europa. I won't do that again. In 2010, one of NASA's epoxy spacecraft sped by the comet Hartley 2. It witnessed a first cosmic snowstorm that's ever been recorded on a moving body. It's not really a snowstorm. What it is in fact is just a whole bunch of terrestrial gas coming off of the surface of this comet. It's being spewed out at sometimes hypersonic speeds, but it's flakes of icy water, some of them the size of a golf ball, others the size of a basketball. And the carbon dioxide, as it warms in the rotation of the sun, just spews all this stuff out into space, and it looks like a snowstorm. A snowstorm on a comet. What a great setting for a story. Science Fiction magazine said that this was the best look at an active comet. And I like to think, again, for the science fiction writing community, for science fiction literature, that these are the types of images that they're going to take into consideration as that genre goes into the 2030s and the 2040s. In this section, The Past for the Future, I want to discuss, just for a few minutes, the major contributors, the attributes, and the writings that develop the literal shape of things to come for science fiction writing. We can't really appreciate the future without taking a look at the past. And in a recent Smithsonian magazine article, essayist Eileen Gunn offered this statement regarding potential future of science fiction literature. She wrote that the task of science fiction is not to predict the future. Rather, it contemplates possible futures. Writers may find the future appealing precisely because it cannot be known, a black box. She stops short of saying whether or not this was a Pandora's box or a container holding Schrodinger's cat, but her words at least provide an explanation for why the predictions of the past haven't exactly caught up to where we currently are. For instance, so many of the novels of the past predicted missions to Mars or deep space colonies in this century. Maybe they'll be right. Maybe those predictions will turn out to be correct. But contemplating those possible futures, it can also have its limitations. And that's going to be a major constraint on the imaginations of the writings going forward. The more we learn, the less we can say is fiction. The more science we demonstrate and prove and can replicate, the more we can say is made up or imagination. So it has this funny effect of like restricting possible interpretations of the future. The more we know, the less we know, or the less we can create, I should say. I think of it a little bit as like trying to think of a different color. Or if you had to add a different numerical figure to the number systems, to any integer, what would come in between 7 and 8? Can you think of what that image would look like in your head? The more we learn, the less we know. And Gunn's statement may be somewhat absolute in its thinking of this unknowable future, but who knows what our ancestors are going to see when we glimpse on the other side of a black hole, or if we venture outside of our solar system for the first time, or if we have the ability to set foot on Martian soil. Who knows what we might see? I did just want to do a mic check. Is my volume okay? Excellent. Okay, good. And again, no discussion of the future can be conducted without first an appreciation of the past. It's in the writings of H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, the grandfathers of science fiction, that we can appreciate sheer imagination, or what, again, Gunn called the possible futures. Between these authors, between their novels, there was a conceptualization of nuclear power, lunar exploration, biological and chemical warfare, invisibility, cryogenic hibernation, subatomic power, deep sea exploration, bioengineering, just to name a few. I had to leave time travel out because we more or less have demonstrated that that can't be done. But boy, would it be fun. Whereas Wells's genius was considered by literary historian John Higgs as his ability to create a stream of brand new, wholly original stories out of thin air, Verne was far more modest about his science fiction predictions. He flatly stated that he had created nothing. Seems kind of strange for the guy who invented 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. He added in an 1895 interview at the time that even before I began writing stories, I always took numerous notes of every book, newspaper, magazine, or scientific report that I came across, every single one. And what a great lesson that is for any science fiction writer or enthusiast today, even for science fiction thinkers. Verne's admission is particularly awesome because the aforementioned quote by Eileen Gunn about the future being unknowable. Well, he read the future by looking at what was around him, by picking up the magazines, the newspapers, the leaflets, the programs of the things that other people were creating, in an academic but also in a very personal sense. It makes one wonder what Verne or Wells could have accomplished with Google. With their minds, what would they have typed in? It would not have been YouTube, I promise you that. Both of these authors added an air of caution to their writings, whether it was Dr. Moreau's tampering with the baseline of the human form, or Verne's motif that some things are simply better left unknown. We probably shouldn't trifle with these things. Their stories foreshadowed the advancements of the 20th century in ways that would be otherwise unassailable were it not for the various science fiction eras of the 20th century that were directly influenced by these two men. I mean, they are the great pillars of this genre. So the point being, as I appreciate these two men from the past, listen to your grandparents. You might actually learn something from them. If I have students in the audience, I hope they heard that. Where are they?
I'm here.
Hello. Okay. The golden era, the golden age of science fiction literature. Again, I'm catching up with the past, going into the future. Wedged between the pulp and new wave eras of science fiction writings, the golden age of sci-fi stories argued to be from the late 1930s until the late 1940s, and some say the 1950s. It depends on who you ask. It provided us with some of the most beautiful, terrifying, and thought-provoking works that collided both mankind and science in a rapidly developing universe. It was no doubt a critical and transitional time that saw both the end of World War II and the frightening promises of the atomic age, and beyond that, the early exploration of space, Sputnik all the way to the Apollo program. Historian Adam Roberts, in his 2006 book, The History of Science Fiction, he wrote, the phase, golden age, valorizes a particular sort of writing, linear narratives, heroes solving problems or countering threats in a space opera or technological adventure idiom. And what does he mean? These were very straight-laced stories. Traditional heroes fighting non-traditional battles against non-traditional enemies. But they were still stories constructed in a way that may have utilized science, but didn't attempt to go beyond it. We were still gaining our bearings. But this was an enormously awesome exploration of science and fiction and the possibilities of the future, hence the Golden Age. Of course, the earlier writers of the Golden Age, among them Jack Vance, who wrote Big Planet, giant hulking planet made out of nothing but metal. Both Friedrich Pohl and Arthur C. Clarke, who often worked together from the early serializations of amazing stories all the way up to their own independent works. Robert Heinlein, who of course needs no introduction whatsoever, everything from Starship Troopers to beyond. Ray Bradbury, the late great. He doesn't often get associated into this category, but he definitely got a start there. A little later, Philip K. Dick, the mind-bending, substance-abusing, science fiction sort of redheaded stepchild. And then later, John Wyndham out of the United Kingdom, who, even though his science fiction has a bit more in common with horror, he definitely demonstrated an outer and inner species invasion from both space and even time. Day of the Triffids is a wonderful example of this. Almost all of these individuals were born between post-World War I and the late 1920s. In the 1950s, the amazing and wonderful serializations of their work was constantly evolving as the world was in a technological and social J-curve. So as these men got into their 30s and 40s, from the 1940s to the 1950s and into the 1960s, the world was changing so much, as you, I'm sure, all well know. I look back at it with envy. They look back on it with a sense that we were just making observations of what we see and where we think it can go. Again, they considered possible futures, as Eileen Gunn pointed out. Next up comes the new waves. The 1960s and 1970s, a little bit similar to the new wave literature of non-genre writing, or new wave cinema at the time. This was often challenging and a little bit disruptive to the status quo. 1960s being disruptive to the status quo? Come on, who would have ever thought that? The new wave era of science fiction literature, however, it examined social, political, and economical problems inherent with alien contact. You can define alien contact however you like. Space exploration, immigration, colonization, and advanced weaponization. Whereas the golden era drew inspiration from the advancements in science and technology, mostly prior to World War II. In this era, they took a much more nuanced and critical look inward into individual identity, that sort of speck of being inside of the cosmos, as Carl Sagan put it. Many of the novels and stories of this time featured more realistic and even relatable characters, a bit more nuanced individuals, because these were people who were venturing outward into the cosmos, encountering beings whose objectives and identities were no longer ambiguous and no longer unappreciable. They may not have been human, but they were still beings. In other words, the antagonists of the new wave era in science fiction literature, they stopped being suction-cupped fingers Martians with brains visible in laser beams, who had no agenda other than to destroy all humans. And they started to become more human-like in their representations. In Ursula Le Guin's 1972 short novel, The Word for World is Forest, which I presented on when I went to Mexico last month, an interplanetary organization manages colonization and industrialization of worlds with suitable raw materials. Now, she wrote this as a direct response to her disapproval of the Vietnam War, but she also indicated that her point was the exploitation of sort of the hidden, untampered worlds, places that maybe we should consider preserving rather than destroying. National forests, the Amazon rainforest, places that once they're gone, we can't get them back. And her Hainish cycle is largely about exactly that type of conflict. The self-awareness was known to many of the era's writers. They were aware that they were challenging the status quo. Among them, science fiction novelist Algis Budrys. He wrote in 1965, the New Wave era was partly a rejection of the golden age of the 1940s. He said that the implication that sheer technological accomplishments, being able to solve all of the problems, was preposterous, and that all of the problems were what they seemed to be on the surface. He was suggesting that writers of this genre had to go deeper, look more closely at themselves, not just the top layer of scientific achievements. With the new wave era of science fiction, while the new wave era of science fiction was nowhere near an organized literary movement, and it wasn't. Many of these people were in direct conflict with each other. They couldn't decide on what version of the future they wanted to give to the public. It did represent a period of time when science fiction was appropriating the cultural shifts that were available to it. Environmental concerns, rise of feminism, anti-war demonstrations, theological alternatives, pyramids, even dietary changes. All of these things worked towards catching up to the future that the previous eras had envisioned. Something that came out of the New Wave era in particular but that was also present during the previous eras, going all the way back to post-Victorian literature, up to pulp, science fiction, and the Golden Age, was this idea of political and social dissent and political change. I wanted to add this list that you can see on the screens behind me because it demonstrates just the sheer scope of that type of political dissent and change. I mean, Jack London's Iron Heel, written in 1908, is a novel that is an epistolary style book. It's a manuscript left behind by a people who have been conquered, and been conquered by an advanced technological form of mankind who took over everything that they had, including their beliefs. Yevgeny Zamyatin, his 1933 book, We, is one of my personal favorites. It was the predecessor of George Orwell's 1984. So many similarities. Whereas George Orwell had the Ministry of Truth, Yevgeny Zamyatin had the one state. Identities were given in forms of numbers. He wrote most of this when he was locked up in a Russian prison. And as a science fiction novel, he wondered about the technological dangers that could be imposed upon people if they didn't have control of it. In other words, technology could be used to constrain individual freedom. Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, massive social and political sort of upheaval as well as experimentation. George Orwell's 1984 goes without saying. That's not typically considered a science fiction. It's much more of a social science fiction story. And these are also cautionary tales. Future dystopias warning of the rise of information control, totalitarianism, loss of identity, and the hypocrisy of classism. I point these ones out because although they span more than 100 years, their individual messages listen to and advance the unstated goals of the eras that they were written in. What I like to put as part two, the possibilities and the realities for science fiction literature going forward. It has a couple very, very serious things to consider. There are some pretty serious blockades that we might have to overcome or at least factor into our imaginations if we want to continue to write stories. Otherwise, we're just going to be writing reality. So in this section, I want to discuss some of the current science fiction literature and its intersection with technological capabilities and the scientific realities that we've learned so far, just a few of them. Some of these realities might feel very, very restrictive. And the term current is a bit loose, give or take a couple decades, but it's essentially everything up from the new wave era of science fiction literature up until now. Excuse me. The first thing among them is the term first contact. I mean, this goes all the way back to the 1940s, 1950s, and gained real traction in the 1960s and 70s. But first contact, that is to say, contact with an alien race, or an interdimensional race, or an intergalactic race, it's a significant part of science fiction literature, and one that the near future is probably going to have to contend with on grand scales or very, very small scales. And as we continue to explore the local neighborhood of our own solar system, we've seen representations of where these might go, these possible futures. In Le Guin's The Hainish Cycle, the one I mentioned previously, a series of loosely related novels, it details the exploration, diplomacy, colonization, and occasional warfare between neighboring star systems, including those of our own native Earth. Several of these novels, including The Left Hand of Darkness and The Dispossessed, they demonstrate the initial shock, dismissal, and eventual acceptance of cultures and beings that are so like one and unlike one another that they've essentially forgotten that they are all one. Unified race of humans under the leadership of the oldest human world, which is called Hain. I point this out because it's not too unlike our own history, which demonstrates that despite our differences, we're all fundamentally one species from the cradle of civilization. The Great Migration took us apart, and now different states, different addresses, different last names. But that is one of the limitations of first contact. Michael Crichton and his debut novel, Andromeda Strain, that deals with first contact in a much more dark and sinister way. First contact to him is in the microbiological sense. An organism not unlike the blob, that with an energy-absorbing ability pays no attention to our puny technological advancements. In other words, it makes no attempt to contact us at all. It just lands on Earth and decides to take over. It's in much of Crichton's work that we see the best of scientific study and innovation. It's at a total loss for dealing with extraterrestrial circumstances. It has no way of even beginning to communicate with the aliens that we might find. That's something that science fiction writers might need to deal with someday. His work enjoys making the first handshake as difficult and as awkward as possible, because you cannot shake hands with a tentacled monster. Rendezvous with Rama, Arthur C. Clarke's, one of his later novels, 1985, he confronted first contact as a confrontation without resolution. In that story, which takes place in the 22nd century, a group of astronauts, they board a massive space cylinder. A little bit like Umamama, the giant meteor that was floating through the local solar system. Only to find out that it has more unanswered questions than answers. There are no inhabitants. There's no terrestrial or extraterrestrial beings. There are the remnants of a city. And every time they discover something new, they have to ask an additional question and an additional question. So first contact may be as elusively out of grasp as it was represented in Rendezvous with Rama. We find an abandoned Starbucks on Mars. Yeah. Michael Faber, I'm skipping this one just for a moment. Michael Faber's excellent debut novel, Under the Skin. Now this pairs first contact in a very, very different way, and it's one of the newer representations post-New Wave. The novel concerns a young alien female who is surgically altered to resemble a human woman. Her goal is very, very simple. She wants to establish contact with vulnerable human outcasts and use them as gourmet meals. While the alien race in this story is uninterested in humans as anything other than a form of takeout, Faber is somehow able to provide the most subtle instances of universal humanity, in that the predator gradually becomes to sympathize with its prey. In these cases, among so many more that I could just go on and on listing, the complexities of first contact show us just how nuanced this one moment of science fiction literature might be. And while the previously mentioned examples of literature examine first contact in extraordinary ways, I do have one more I'd like to share with you. It's only a 2-minute clip. But the 2016 film The Arrival, which was based on the short story, The Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang, it offered a wonderful glimpse into the difficulties that are often overlooked in establishing first contact in sci-fi literature. And in this scene, the concepts of language, syntax, and the meaning itself are represented as fundamental challenges that alone can be the basis for an entire story. So I'd like to play that with you now. Can everyone see it okay? Yeah. Okay.
Here are some of the many things we don't know about heptapods. Greek, hepta 7, pod, foot, 7 feet, heptapod. Who are they? Trying to answer this in any meaningful way is hampered by the fact that outside being able to see them and hear them, the heptapods leave absolutely no footprint. The chemical composition of their spaceship is unknown. The shell emits no waste, no gas, no radiation. Assuming that the shells communicate with each other, they do so without detection. The air between the shells is untroubled by sonic emission or light wave. Are they scientists or tourists? If they're scientists, they don't seem to ask a lot of questions. why did they park where they did? The world's most decorated experts can't crack that one. The most plausible theory is that they chose places on Earth with the lowest incidence of lightning strikes. But there are exceptions. The next most plausible theory is that Sheena Easton had a hit song at each of these sites in 1980, so we just don't know.
How do they communicate? Here, Louise is putting us all to shame.
The first breakthrough was to discover that there's no correlation between what a heptapod says and what a heptapod writes. Unlike all written human languages, their writing is semasiographic. It conveys meaning. It doesn't represent sound. Perhaps they view our form of writing as a wasted opportunity, passing up a second communications channel.
Walmart Plus.
No.
I always hate the fact that aliens in most fiction always speak English.
It's true. Another constraint or obstacle that science fiction literature may face in the future is the Fermi paradox. Enrico Fermi, as I'm sure many know, he postulated that Italian-American physicist, he asked the big question, where are the aliens? Where is everybody? One can hardly be blamed for wondering, considering the vastness of the universe, something on the order of 300 to 400 billion galaxies. It seems inconceivable to think that we're actually alone. But if that's the case, how and why have we not come across even the remnants of a deceased civilization on Mars, intercepted a radio signal from eons ago, or the vast, or at the very least, become the rest stop for an alien race that's road tripping across the universe? And sci-fi literature has had a field day with all of these scenarios. All of them have been the basis either of a novel or a film or both. But Fermi's paradox does present a problem for the genre, as I've indicated, and I'd like to explain why. While there are countless nonfiction, scientific, and pseudoscientific books that have been written about the paradox, very troubling question. And it does indeed provide a problem for writers if our imaginations require some frame of reference to what we know is even representable, then not knowing who or what is out there can create something, creating something new extremely difficult. So if we have no way to associate a representation of anything, a sign or a signifier, we have no way of conveying meaning in that story, potentially, at least not anything new, anything unexplored. That being said, every science fiction novel or sci-fi movie about an alien invasion has already addressed Fermi's paradox, as I mentioned before. Fermi's paradox, the simple answer for all of the literature of the past is that they have to come to us. We're not going to find them. The universe is too big, so they need to come to us. We're hosting Thanksgiving. H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, John W. Campbell's Who Goes There, great classic. Jack Finney's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and the subsequent movie adaptations, and also Neil Blomkamp's District 9. In all of these scenarios, an organized but completely indifferent alien population that regards mankind with no regard whatsoever, it just sees us as an available resource. So that's the answer to Fermi's paradox. I think we can do better. I think that science fiction writers can do better. And there is one example that stands out among all of these to offer a glimpse as to how. In Carl Sagan's 1985 novel, it confronted the question in a very poignant and very anticlimactic way, which proved to be wonderful. His book used the Fermi paradox as the central core of its story. It was a a paradox that Sagan himself was obsessed with for much of his life. One that motivated its characters, rationalized its science, and provided one of the most moving reflection on humanity's lonely place in the cosmos. So perhaps the answer from the future of science fiction writing, for the future of science fiction writing, focus on the particulars, not the macro questions, not the expanse of the universe, as beautiful as it is. That approach may take some patience from a science fiction writer and perhaps not be as much fun, because a narrative without some manner of direct conflict becomes very difficult to tell. Or does it? And again, we may have a word from our sponsors. Just kidding. But I'd like to just share a brief clip from the 1997 adaptation of Contact, which is called Contact.
You can see over there, we're building 45 brand new dishes. And that means that when you put them together with all the different radio telescopes all over the world, then we get to hear farther into space than anybody's ever heard before. Yeah.
Are there other people out there in the universe?
That's a good question. What do you think, huh?
I don't know.
It's a good answer. Skeptic, huh? Well, the most important thing is that you all keep searching for your own answers. I'll tell you one thing about the universe, though. The universe is a pretty big place. It's bigger than anything anyone has ever dreamed of before. So if it's just us, it seems like an awful waste of space. Right?
So looking for your place in the universe, you can find it in the palm of your hand. Another constraint, another conflict that we might have to deal with in science fiction literature, cyber and cybernetic times. Long before metaverse, Twitter, Ready Player One, or VR gaming, cyberspace, a term coined by William Gibson because he thought it sounded cool, that virtual self-indulgent cornucopia of possibilities, is a potential landscape for the singularity between man and machine. No consistent definition of cyberspace has ever been agreed upon. In fact, William Gibson was very dismissive of the term. A paper by Marco Meyer, International Politics in the Digital Age, he said that the term has no doubt established its position at the table for possible futures in the science fiction literature as well as politics and society. Thank you. I'm going to skip down just one. Similar to the virtual realities, we have the equally well-established simulated realities, the androids, the replicants, the cyborgs, the being who yearns to be more than human, those beings who desire to cross the uncanny valley that robotics professor Masahiro Mori proposed in the early 1970s. This was perhaps represented no better than in Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? That uncanny valley is that chasm between what you recognize as real and what you know to be unreal. More than that, it's the realization that you are gradually becoming immune to the otherness of that thing. So as time progresses, whether it's virtual or whether it's artificial, that gap will begin to close. This robot that you see in the middle screen, the middle GIF image, is a representation of Dr. Mori. He modeled it after his own face. It looks like him, it sounds like him because it uses his voice as a replication, and it answers his questions. At times, you can stop to think, which one am I actually talking to? And I have a twin brother, so I know how that feels. But that uncanny valley is going to be something that as we advance robotics, as we advance cybernetics, as we advance virtual realities, science fiction writers are going to have to deal with this in some way. They're going to have to continue to play catch up. We've already caught up. I think 1989 was the year we finally caught up. That's just a rough guess. That was when they were supposed to make those hoverboards. But the future is like a goalpost that is constantly moving forward. And these are just examples of how it's being moved. And as we say where to now, there's a couple things to consider. Shortest section of the speech. I know we're running close to time. Daryl, are we good for time? Thank you. I'd like to just share some considerations on how our current and accelerating technology may shape future science fiction literature. The technological innovations such as NASA's proposed Stafford Torus project, which can house up to 1 million people in an off-colony, self-reliant mechanism. In the near to far future, the millennium and forward, perhaps into the 31st and even 41st centuries and beyond, the literature may consider post-humanism. That is, neo-mortal humans who have departed the boundaries of the flesh and uploaded their consciousness into programmable, ever-expanding data. So why be a human when you can simply be a computer program? You never have to diet again. You won't ever have to get a haircut again. You just may need to debug yourself occasionally. We also have nanotechnology and interstellar travel. We're not quite there yet with either of these two, but they're definitely catching up. Day by day, it seems, we make more and more advancements in this. Terraforming and proto-habitable worlds, the Saturnian moon of Titan, Mars, of course, our next door neighbor. In the far future, potentially Venus, as our sun begins to shrink and sort of cool down. Who knows where this might go? That's the Stafford Torus design, big giant space donut floating outside of the atmosphere, outside of the gravity of Earth. But there it is, a self-sustaining habitat for off-world colonists. And the last one I'd like to share, the Kardashev scale. Right now, we might consider ourselves something of a type 0 civilization. Despite our advancements, the Kardashev scale is the measurement of technological advancement achieved by a civilization based upon how much energy it utilizes. A type 1 civilization is able to access all of the available energy and resources on its planet. Every single part, the wind, the soil, the sun, the sun as it is directed at the planet, that is. And theoretically can even control natural elements such as wind, hurricanes, rain. That would be lovely. Make it rain. Rain day, no work. Type 2 civilizations directly control the resources of their nearest star. So we would basically be in charge of the sun. Although it would require enormous amounts of energy, enormous amounts of power, and an infrastructure that we are not yet capable of designing. And then a type 3 civilization, as you might guess, can control the energy within a galaxy. That is tens of thousands, if not millions of years in the future. But as we make advancements, inch by inch, we might start to slowly catch up to these things. Or who knows, we may be visited by beings who provide us with these abilities. They recently discovered, just yesterday, a star that is about to go supernova that has an odd shape around it, not like a cube. It has been postulated by scientists that this might actually be a Dyson sphere controlling a dying sun. Who knows? We might find out. And I'm going to skip this last section because I know we're running short on time. But very briefly, the known knowns, it's what you're aware of and you understand. The unknown knowns, you're not aware of it, but you would understand it in practice, like algebra. The known unknowns, you are aware of those, but you do not understand them. An iPhone, for me. I'm not afraid to admit that. Yeah. And then last but not least, there are the unknown unknowns. You're not aware of them, and even if you were, you could not understand them. Those four principles, those four types of knowledge, it's sort of a mixture of something that Donald Rumsfeld once said, but also Dr. David Krathwohl. He said that these are the things that we need to be aware of as science fiction advances itself, if it wants to stay current, if it wants to stay interesting. And last but not least, I always tell my students that ending on a quote is fine, but it's got to have context and substance. It's got to actually connect contextually with the material. There's two quotes I want to share, if I may. They're very brief, I promise. First one, I'm a great lover of history. The end of the Battle of El Alamein, Churchill said, "This is not the end, this is not the beginning of the end, but it may be the end of the beginning." Science fiction literature is kind of at that point, I think. It's catching up to itself. And then the second one comes from a poem by T.S. Eliot that I just love, called Little Gidding. And in the fifth stanza of that poem, he says, "We shall not cease from exploring, and at the end of our exploration will be to return to where we started and come to know that place for the first time." And I hope that's where science fiction literature brings us. And on that note, I'd like to welcome any questions, wish all of you a very, very happy Thanksgiving and safe travels, and thank you so much for your kind attention.